Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to listen to Ocean Nexus webinar. We had some technical difficulties, and I have lost one of the presenters. Maybe I can still see it. Andres, you still there?
He's just
Yes, I'm back.
rejoining
I don't
now.
know what happened there.
Okay, all right. Yeah, it's your camera, and my computer just died. So I apologize. I'm working with my iPhone, but I'm not the main presenter. So I'm sure this is fine. Okay, thank you very much. So thank you so much. This is Ocean Nexus webinar, and today we're really going to talk about quantitative data in ocean equity. It's just really the topic everybody asks. Okay, equity, how can you measure it? Equity, how can you just work on it? And the simple answer is equity itself. The measurement is extremely challenging because once we measure it, then we have to assess it. And as we assessing it, then we have to change the way to measure it. But then again, we can actually see the performance of certain policies and consider if this is an equitable approach or not. So this is this idea about data and equity, rather than trying to say what we need for measuring equity. We're just going to work with what is currently available, but yet, if there is a gap, we're going to compose the data in order to assess what is necessary to consider for the performance. And this is what we are really talking about here today. And so I have my two long-term collaborators, Dr. Andrés Cisneros-Montemayor from Simon Fraser University, and Dr. Gerald Singh from University of Victoria. Both of you, how long have we been working together? About like 10 years or more?
I started
Nine.
working with you in 2017, but I'm relatively new compared to Andres.
Oh my God. I mean, it's 2017, so it's 8 years. What about you, Andres? I can't remember though. Was it like 2013 or something like
Yeah,
that?
exactly. I was gonna
Yeah.
say,
So yeah, thank you very much, for working with me. I wouldn't. But then again, when I met, so both Gerald and Andres, their background is really about the. It's not, well, it's kind of a social science, but Andres, you call yourself resource economist,
yeah, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I would say economics is in the social
right?
sciences, but I'm
Yeah.
definitely more quantitative in my sort of forming and stuff there.
Okay, what about you, Gerald? Then
I
how
was
you call
trained
you?
as an ecologist. I was trained as a biological scientist, and then also a lot of work in resource management and evaluation. So, yeah, and then you got me looking at governance questions. So,
Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist, and there's always a frustration coming from if you don't really know what your aim is. There's always the frustration that the qualitative side, like anthropology and sociology, we need to show some evidence. We need to show some numbers. And if people ask us to show us some numbers, so there's one side of it. And the other side is when you're looking at just the numbers, right? Such as index, and it's so poorly done. It's not really, it's always sort of based on very strong political agenda. If you look at the World Bank, you could really see it, the national ranking, the international ranking is always that, or enticing some of the financial investments. That's another thing, or really to make some investment or some the schemes which actually benefit not the people who are stakeholders. Well, I mean, stakeholders is not the people in the community, but outside of it to benefit. I mean, that's another scheme to bring those indices and an index and the numbers and assessment. And sometimes it is hugely used for market penetration, right? For instance, I believe there's a lot of talk about insurance. The one of the concern is, well, insurance is a very useful tool. It's something we need to have, for the upcoming climate change and in all the impact. And this is something it's good things to have. It's something we must have. And if it's something we must have, why it is done by private? It's just a similar question to the universal care or universal healthcare. If something we must have, why is it done by private? It's a huge equity question over there, right? So, but aside from that, okay, what we'd like to show you guys today is how we create. It's not a great word to use, create, isn't it? But we're going to use it anyway because all the data is created. How we created data to argue the things we consider it's very important to put it on the table for the ocean equity conversation. And so we're going to have, it's going to be based on 2 publications, which Karen, thank you very much for putting on the chat. Anybody interested in, please have a look at it. And so Andres' work is on ocean energy. It's a last mile paper. 3 weeks ago, when was it published? Or months ago?
I believe so. Yeah.
Something
Just
like that.
recently. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. It took us 4 years.
Well, I mean, concept, but
From the
I think a
concept,
solid 2 years of data work.
right. But it took us 3 years because it really started from the scratch. And Gerald's work on MPA, this is a long journey. How long did it take? No, you're not from the beginning. I was
wasn't
from
there
the
from the
beginning.
beginning. I was brought in later.
Right.
Yeah.
I was from the beginning, and it took us as long as Nexus. That's about 6
2019.
years. Yeah, it started 6 years ago, right? Andreas' argument, which he's going to repeat, is quite straightforward. If we're going to work about energy, why we are not considering where the energy transition is needed, where the energy needs to be secured, and where are those communities? What do we need to do? Well, I mean, we don't get into what we need to do. It's pretty much straightforward. But let's show where we need to reach to make energy security happen. Before we're talking about large, grid-based, the energy transition, which some people call it just, but potentially it's not, right? So that's Andres' paper, and Gerald's paper. My God, is it's so when we talk about MPA, marine protected area, there's been all the arguments and studies which says marine protected area will bring social benefit. Sounds great. Show us where is this, show us the evidence, right? Show us the scale of the argument and show us what we really know about this. MPA is also good for the society. So that's Joe's paper. And both of it really happened from the conversation between conservationists and people who really both care about the people and the nature. And so, we those who worked on large scale data because the conversation is slightly not mainstream, and then people often demands some of the new knowledge and the data set to prove this argument is relevant. So I'm going to pass it to, who's going to go first? Andres, you're going to go first? I don't know. You're going to go first. Okay, so Andres, you go first, and then Gerald, just follow it, and we're going to have a discussion and questions. Thank you so much, both of you.
Andres, you've muted yourself.
Yeah, I'm just getting the screen up. Here we go. All right. Thank you so much for that, Yoshi. And thanks everyone for being here. I see a lot of people that I know. Thanks for being here. And people that I've read a lot about. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. As Yoshi mentioned, I'm going to talk about ocean energy and the blue economy, and what we call last mile electrification. And I'll explain what that is in a second. This comes from a paper, and I really want to acknowledge everyone who worked on this. Shayna Hirsch, Trent Dillon, Pedro Gonzalez Espinosa, Marcia Moreno-Baez, Mohamed Tixesade, Nasir, as we know him, and Yoshitaka, who all worked on this. The link is here in the paper if you want to get the open access to it. And I believe Karen also shared the link in there. So first of all, what are last mile electrification and equitable energy access? Last mile electrification is all about bringing energy to people in places that lack access. And the reason it's called that, and sort of in that literature, in that field of development, really, is that these places are by definition marginalized. So they're on the margins, literally, of our electrical grids. But it's often seen as uneconomical to connect someone to an existing grid, right? So if you are strapped for cash in a country or a city, you'll be much more likely to invest in maybe strengthening the grids in the core areas, the core urban areas, rather than bringing sort of a last mile of cable or whatever to people that are out in rural communities. And so obviously the issue is that it can just perpetuate this marginalization, right? It'll never be economical to bring power out there, but that's not really the point, is it? And that's what we talk about when we talk about equitable energy access. Now, what I really want to highlight, and this was recently kind of brought to the fore by Benito Martinez, is that equitable energy access is really multi-tiered, and it's actually a multi-tiered framework for energy access that I put the link to there. And it includes capacity, which is what we're focusing on here, and availability. So whether or not you're connected to a grid, whether or not there are energy potentials around you, in this case, renewable. But it also includes things like reliability, the quality of power, affordability, formality. So whether or not you have legal access to power. I don't know where everyone is in the world, but I know in my hometown, it's very, very common to, hang a wire from the main lines, right? And so can you say you have energy access? Well, kind of. And then finally, health and safety risks. And it's a lot of these things kind of compound each other, right? So if you are hanging a wire from the main grid and you don't know exactly what you're doing, there might be a huge risk to your personal safety and health. And this is something like this photo shows that we see all over the world play out, right? So just because there are sort of electrical wires doesn't necessarily mean that equitable energy access is secure. And so I wanted to really put that out there because, to Yoshi's point, equity is really, really difficult to get at. And actually, I should have started with this. I mean, Yoshi, you asked a question, how do you measure equity? And I would say flat out, you don't. You can't. It's not something that's measurable. And I think it's counterproductive to try and have like an index or something, or an indicator of equity as a whole, right? You really have to focus on specific context, specific characteristics, and that could be just as powerful as having just sort of a big indicator of the types that we're used to working with for other sorts of development questions. And so in this case, we're really just focusing on availability and local potential for energy. Why renewable energy? Well, for those of you who know me, a lot of my background is in fisheries, ecotourism, a lot of the more kind of resource-based marine industries. So I'm a resource economist. But renewable energy is actually by far the largest destination of investments labeled as blue economy. So this is some work, really fantastic work done by Marlene Shooter in 2024. And in this graph, you can see every bar there is a level of investment relative to industry size, right? So what that means is that renewable energy is a relatively still a bit smaller industry than others, but it has a huge amount of private, public, intergovernmental investment all around the world. And these investments, as I said, I mean, you can look at this bar, that kind of teal color is development banks, right? The role of development banks is to fund development in regions that are developing. And so you would expect to see these kinds of investments done in places that are lacking in energy or that don't have access to equitable energy, right? And here we're talking about things like offshore wind, primarily. This is the vast majority of it, but also some incipient kind of research and investment into wave power or sometimes tidal. And solar in some places, it's really interesting because solar isn't technically like an ocean renewable category. But obviously, if you're living on a coast and you have the space, why wouldn't you try and put some solar panels? And so sometimes it is a little bit wrapped up in this a little bit. So we decided to include it as well. However, when we look at where this money is flowing, and you can see on the sand key on the far right, are kind of marked with a red box, where that renewable energy is. So you can see, it's a big chunk.
Is Andres still on the call?
I think Andres was dropped.
Andres
Yeah.
is dropped.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we just, I'm sorry, everyone. Thank you very much for being there. We're just gonna wait like 3 minutes until Andres will come back, and we can continue. Is anybody also in this call?
I think just you, Yosh.
I think Nasir is on call. Nasir, you worked on this?
Yeah, Nasir's on.
Right.
And Marcia too.
Oh, Marcia as well? In that case, we can have both of them. Nasir, Marcia, you both worked on this. Can you tell us what you did? Marcia, thank you so much.
Hello, everyone.
Great to have you.
Sorry, I cannot turn on my camera though, but I hope that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine. We have a lovely picture of yours, and that's good enough. Marcia, can you just tell us, what you did for this paper?
Absolutely. So we work, as Andres already mentioned, and we worked for a while in this publication, compiling. Basically, a couple of us, we were, including Pedro. We were compiling information for a while. Well, first of all, defining the criteria, right? How are we going to measure basically access to electricity? How can we do that? But taking into account the coastal marine resources. And of course, we know that most of the development, even though it's happening in those areas, there's still areas with lacking access, right? And so we first defined the criteria and discussed that for a while, because that's the first step. After that, we start looking for data. Okay, what's available? At what scale is available? And when I talk about scale, is what's the spatial scale and temporal scale. That means what is the latest data sets that have been published for each one of the criteria that we wanted to include. And then, of course, the process of compiling this information and managing or processing the information based on all of these different characteristics that the data had. There was a lot of time invested in the discussion in terms of, okay, the scale, the spatial scale, how large of an area do we want to analyze this information? And when I talk about, when I say that scale or a spatial unit of analysis is basically what is the size in which we can determine a level of access, if it's good access or not, and then basically the potential for those areas to be developed or to develop or implement infrastructure so people can access to electricity. And then the rest is just basically applying once the methodology, analytical methodology was defined, which was basically something that Andres already had worked in other paper that we have as well for the blue economy. A similar approach was applied for these to analyze this information and get those areas with high or low access or need or potential for electricity. Sorry for the noise. There's a lot of noise here. I'm going to mute myself, but if you have more questions, happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Marcia.
Of course.
Thanks. Great to hear from you. Yeah, Dr. Marcia from Tufts University. Andres, back to you.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
It is snowing, but well, reliable energy access, right? Thank you so much, Marcia, for explaining the methodology. I was actually almost done, and I'm glad that my audio cut out because you couldn't hear me swear when the computer started going down. But the main two things that we're looking at are where do people need energy and where is the renewable energy potential? And so this is where Yoshi was saying, this is where it's so important to have a very clear idea of what it is we're trying to measure, right? Because again, if you wanted to just measure like an index of equitable energy, that would again be so complicated and difficult to do, right? So you really have to break it down into a very specific thing that you can measure. So where do people need energy? Well, where are their energy grids? And luckily, now there are actually some really big programs around the world to map out even the minor grids around the world. And so you can see really quickly, all the areas that are blacked out are places that don't have a connection to a main energy grid, right? And you can immediately think to yourself, wait a minute, I know there's people there. What's going on, right? So those are the places, right? Those places that all over Australia, Central Africa, all over the Arctic. You'll notice there's not almost a single island in this particular, except for Caribbean, maybe Iceland, right? So all over the South Pacific, many, many places that are not connected to these main grids. So the second part is where is the renewable energy potential? These are the ones that I mentioned. And as Marcia just mentioned, we already had a methodology for this and really high resolution data to work towards it. And this is where it was really important to work with experts in these fields, right? So just as we always say, if you're working on equity, you should have some actual experts in that field, social scientists, anthropologists, et cetera. Same thing with this, right? There are experts that know exactly what you need if you're going to have solar power installed, if you're going to have offshore wind energy installed. And so these are some of the inputs that we put in here. Trent Dillon, Shannon Hirsch were really instrumental in this part of the analysis. So you put it together, and all these areas that are kind of in a darker purple are ones that are not connected to main grids, but have high potential for renewable energy, right? So those are the places and people that would benefit the most. And unfortunately, if you can see the black outlines in Northern Europe, there's one little one there in the Northeast US. Actually, I think that's Rhode Island. One tiny one in Australia. Those are the places where we actually have this investment, right? So remember those graphs that I showed you at the beginning that Marlene made? That's where all the money is flowing, and not to, again, the entire Pacific Ocean, the entire Atlantic Ocean, the entire Arctic, Patagonia, so many parts in the world. And so these discourses around the blue economy matter because people are hearing blue economy and they're seeing that these sorts of investments, and even in a small, very concrete example, are fundamentally inequitable. They just do not match what we're saying, right? And so data in this sort of example can help us push back against those narratives so that we make sure that the blue economy or whatever it is we're doing is serving local communities. So that's it for me. Thank you so much, Yoshi. Apologies for the technical glitch there. And I'll stop sharing. And I imagine we'll have questions at the end, or
yeah.
I'm happy to take them now too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Andres, I'm probably going to ask, does it basically talk, discussion about on the grid or off the grid? Or is it more like a discussion about the energy efficiency? Or is it more like, some of the things that people say about we need the energy security, we have to transfer the technology to the seats and other places? If you can just think about it, that'd be really great. Sure. And the main part is that this is to show what has not been shown. And that is really the conversation starting. If you're going to think about whether our energy blue economy, the discussion is really moving towards or targeting some of the energy invariance or variance that we have for the energy rich country to the energy poor countries. Okay, now I'm gonna pass it to Gerald. Gerald, can you speak about something completely different, which we worked for a long time?
Yeah, thanks, Yosh. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this. Yeah, okay, so Yoshi said very different. I see it as kind of similar in that I think both Andres and I are talking about interventions. Andres talking about energy transitions and renewable energy-based interventions. I'm talking about conservation. In both cases, I think there's a risk in terms of if you're doing work in service of what you see as good interventions, and that's part of the theme here. So to go back a second, it's worth thinking about when we're doing research towards sustainable development, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which has this kind of underlying value of equity. It's some of the main goals around ending poverty, hunger, et cetera, and the most focus on the most marginalized. That's what sustainable development is supposed to be. And the SDGs, as much as they're celebrated, one of their main drawbacks is there was no plan in place for them and how to achieve them. And so that's where different kinds of interventions come into play, and where different actors, as they are trying to make the case for different interventions, start doing their work. And so there's a bunch of different interventions that have been proposed in the marine realm that are supposed to contribute to sustainable development. And so I've kind of categorized them around as they've been initially formatted, either to address environmental goals or economic goals, or kind of straddling across. But with more and more attention paid to equity and sustainability, almost all of them have been kind of recast as being in service of social equity. And so it's worth kind of interrogating this, like to what degree are they actually doing this? Before we jump into MPAs in particular, it's also worth considering the potentials for different MPAs to contribute to nefarious issues like greenwashing. So this is a report that came out from the UN a couple of years ago now, really lambasting major organizations such as private firms that are promoting their own interventions by overstating their effects towards the environment and sustainability. And I fear that the same thing is also happening when it comes to social equity. So are we looking at interventions and equity washing their contributions? One potential example to look at is marine protected areas. And so can we look at ocean conservation now selling itself as a development tool? This is a model that Justin Nowakowski put out in a paper he was involved with a few years ago, kind of documenting the causes. How does ocean conservation contribute to development? And it's this kind of simple causal structure. If you have marine protected areas, that's going to contribute to things like better, healthier marine ecosystems, because you're protecting it from some of the most point source and persistent harms to marine ecosystems. People who benefit from that, such as increased ecotourism and fishers themselves, this will actually have social benefits in the end. And so this is the kind of causal change. This is the logic behind equating conservation with development. And so we can see in this case, it's a study that's trying to make the case essentially that marine conservation contributes to poverty reduction, for example. You get increases in wealth with more fish found at site. And so this was kind of part of the analysis done. So you can look kind of at these scales. There's been a bunch of different more meta-analyses done across scales, looking across studies, trying to document the effects of marine protected areas and their positive, negative, and kind of more ambiguous effects across different economic, social, cultural dimensions. So this was a study led by Natalie Ban, one of my colleagues in my department a few years ago, we have to be a bit careful with studies like this that are looking across studies, these kind of meta-analyses, partly because any review is more an indication of what's being studied more so than what's happening in reality. And so in that it's really just reflecting what scientists look at, not necessarily what's really going around the world. And so with that in mind, we took on this research to look at what evidence is there that marine protected areas are contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So kind of really jumping off of studies like this that Natalie did, but looking explicitly at the Sustainable Development Goals and looking more specifically at the research being done. And so some of what we found was essentially just like the growth in literature around marine protected areas and their contribution to development categories. So on the top here, we see essentially this count of numbers of papers, either looking at reviews, original research, etc., across the years. And in this bottom panel, this is more of a citation count. And what's one of the first things we see is the over-reliance or the extra effect that reviews have had. And this isn't necessarily surprising. We see this in a lot of different fields. But it does mean that our understanding of the effects of marine protected areas is kind of amplifying older findings in some ways. And when we look at more kind of the individual effects of, or the research on individual effects of marine protected areas across the Sustainable Development Goals, part of the reason this work took so long was the team went target by target. So there's 169 SDG targets. They looked target by target to see where evidence was for effects of MPAs. And so this map it's busy, but it kind of just documents, I think, two important points. One is that every SDG area, every SDG goal, there's potential for effect by marine protected areas. So the size of the radial in this is the proportion of targets within each goal, where we found papers suggesting effects of MPAs on the SDG target. The second point is that across every goal, there's mixed effects. That there's no clear positives, no clear negatives. There's suggestion that MPAs can have positive or negative across every single dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals. We looked a little bit more in depth at three Sustainable Development Goals, three areas that are a bit more traditionally focused on in development research, the poverty, hunger, and issues of gender equality. And we wanted to look at the kind of evidence that's being proposed. And so a little bit of there's a lot packed in these radial diagrams here. But first is that every time you see the purple here, this is documenting positive effects of MPAs on the SDG area. Negatives are represented in this kind of salmon red color, and we have both positive and negatives represented in the yellow. And so you see kind of a difference. For gender equality, more literature we found pointed to negative effects. For reducing hunger, more positive. For reducing poverty, a bit more mixed. In a lot of cases, you see actually a reliance on secondary data, except for negative effects on gender equality. So again, it's pointing a bit to this reliance on amplifying existing data and findings. And so part of the title of our report is that MPAs have mixed effects across Sustainable Development Goals, but effects might be overstated, partly because of the reliance on secondary data that passes through again and again with new papers. Another thing to point out is that a lot of research is done multi-site, and this is potentially problematic if work is being done across multi-site, so you're aggregating effects across sites. But then if you're actually advocating for the use of marine protected areas in specific sites, there's a scale mismatch there. because in reality, you don't counteract the negative effects of one MPA with positive effects of another. And so you have to be very, very careful about how you interpret this data, and especially its suggestions for policy uptake. But so this is the beginning of just looking at the evidence kind of across papers. But I also wanted to take a little bit of time to jump into some limitations of specific evidence. And in general, we found about 3. There's even more, but I wanted to point out 3 what I consider problem areas of some specific evidence. One is that some results are artifacts. And so an artifact in a scientific sense means you have a finding from a study, but it's actually context dependent on the study itself. It does not reflect reality. The choices you make in the study, so Yoshi brought up earlier, data is always created. It's very true across every scientific field, and it's created partly by the choices a researcher makes. The choices made in the research process can affect the results. And in some cases, when it comes to artifacts, it's actually skewing results away from what's in reality versus what's in the study itself. So one really major issue we found is there's quite a few studies, especially ones we found that are documenting positive effects, that essentially start with the assumption that there's well-managed marine protected areas, that they have sufficient budget, capacity, and they are limiting destructive practices. But this was a really great work done by Pike and her colleagues in 2024, essentially showing that fully protected marine protected areas are very much a rarity around the world. And they found by far over half, it's more likely if a marine protected area is set up that it's not going to be effective. Either it's lacking the necessary capacity to actually deliver on its promises, or it's allowing highly destructive activities. So it might actually be limiting artisanal fisheries, for example, and maybe some industrial fisheries, but allowing oil and gas and other highly risky activities within it. And so if you're doing a study and you're doing it on a well-functioning MPA, and then you're making claims about the benefits of MPAs broadly, you're not capturing the reality of MPA implementation. So that's one. We also found in some cases results are quite biased in terms of the data collection. So let's go back to Justin Nowakowski's research, and you'll see that the causal model that they investigated is only looking at positive effects. We know, however, that there's a more complex causal model at work when you relate marine protected areas with human communities. And so we can look kind of across. This is that simple marine protected areas increases fish biomass, which has benefits to people. But we also know that marine protected areas can contribute to displacement. And that usually affects people who are the most marginalized and receive the fewest benefits and social advantages in general. And so if both of those characteristics can affect who is displaced. And so if you do an analysis and you disregard this kind of displacement effect and you are conditioning your analysis on any people who are remaining, you can bias your analysis. And a simple illustration can look like this. If you kind of break your data into areas with fishing restrictions versus areas with no fishing restrictions, people who have negative effects versus people with positive effects, even if you had no effect across these conditions, if you neglect the people who are really seriously negatively affected with fishing restrictions, you ignore these red points. And what is this kind of cloud of data with no signal looks like a positive relationship across fishing closure. And so that's what's going on if you have biased data and biased data collection. And we do see this a little bit in the MPA literature. The last thing I want to point out is an area that Shana, Elaine, and I have started talking about, and it's ignoring the dynamics that are inherent in the promise of marine protected areas. So to illustrate, let's say we're thinking about marine protected areas in general. Here's just a map of the marine protected area network in Australia. The promises are almost all long-term. So it takes years generally for the fish biomass and marine ecosystem to recover through marine protected areas to deliver on these benefits to communities. In the meantime, it has to navigate a bunch of short-term impacts which may be negative. And so if the MPA is set up, especially if it's externally imposed on a community without regards to a lot of social context, it can lead to increased conflict within the community. It can reinforce economic disparities. It can lead to a lot of legitimacy concerns with governance around the community, even increased poaching as people are negatively affected. They need to get access to resources. You've suddenly criminalized an activity that they've been doing for a long time. So navigating the short term, which might be more immediate, might be more certain, in some cases, to get to this long term is actually quite challenging, especially since the longer in the future you're considering, the more context variation you have to address, both in the environment and also in governance capacity. So it's really hard in reality to balance the short-term risks with the long-term benefits, but this is quite often brushed aside in the literature. Short-term negatives are often brushed aside with the promise of long-term benefits, even though they might be more uncertain. And so these kind of three major areas we found throughout the literature. So just to close, I mean, for me, marine protected areas are tools, and what we need is to really evaluate them as tools that are achieving given purpose. What should be of relevance is the purpose. And we have to really watch out for research that's essentially playing as advertisement for the tool, just because we assume they're good. So I'll just close it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerald. We have a limited time, and then I just wanted to open the floor for anyone who wants to ask a question. I'm sure, this is not really what has been advocated, what has been told to advocate MPA. So we're going a little bit so like a different way. So surely the people do have some questions. And then I do have one question from Omar. Is saying multidimensional and normative nature of equity. We're actually questioning the normative nature of equity. I really do not think MPA is by nature equitable simply because it just really doesn't address the function to it. But you're still asking fuzzy logic-based index could provide a more robust framework. Who should I pass it to? It's either of you. Fuzzy logic is more like Andreas thinks, but
yeah, no, you know what?
Gerald work on it.
It's a really interesting question, and Gerald, I'd love to see what you think about it. Thank you, Omar. And I think fuzzy logic can actually be quite useful if you wanted to sort of like get a better sense of kind of like equitable processes or something. And I think this is what you're asking. It would only really be useful in a local sense, right? If you were setting it up locally with local information, it might be helpful. I guess my question would be, what is the goal of that? Right.
Yeah.
So why do you want to get a local sense of how equitable this place is with fuzzy logic, right? I mean, I think that's something you could get more easily qualitatively. Because I think the risk, and this is where we started talking actually when Yoshi first mentioned, is using that same framework to apply it to another community, which again, totally fine. but there's going to be a huge, huge temptation to compare, right? And as soon as you're comparing equity indices across different places, that's when you can get really into trouble, right? So if you're using it to maybe highlight some issues that could be at work in a community, I think it might be very useful. But as sort of a tool for measurement of equity, again, I think it could end up being problematic. But Gerald, I'll pass it to you because
Andres, in some ways, sort of like I learned quite a bit about the fuzzy logic, really setting up the range of the things to understand, potentially understand more of the sort of like people's perception and reflect it upon the indices and the measurement. I mean, that's really the function to it. So to some extent, if you like to measure inequity with particular populations that we actually know they're suffering from the inequality, that could potentially be useful. I mean, this is some sort of like work Gerald and I did some time ago for the equity or inequity performance, or more like looking at the risk. Yeah, Gerald, would you like to comment on that? Like,
sure, yeah. I mean,
inequity part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with Andres, especially in that that comment of depends how far you want to go. I mean, fuzzy logic it's a technical approach to addressing uncertainty. And it's particularly good at kind of exploring across, it's specifically made for very uncertain terms. It's originally made for so-called linguistic uncertainty. What does the term mean? And how do you get everything? How do you measure it? And so fuzzy logic, I could see it being useful for exploring kind of the range of responses, or the range of notions of what equity means if you break it down across dimensions and other things like that. Where I see it as being problematic is when you keep going with it, because a lot of fuzzy logic models, the idea is to to take a fuzzy concept and make it crisp. And so Andres and I have worked in the past on using fuzzy logic systems for biodiversity measures, where you have these vague notions, and you throw a bunch of indices at it, and you essentially have an all or none response. You get these measurements that go from 0 to 100. The most variation possible. And then if you took that and you tried to crisp it into one number, you lose all of that variation. And so that's when it becomes really problematic. And I would also say it becomes problematic if you use fuzzy logic to operationalize a multi-criteria model that's reducing everything to a single dimension. You lose all of that. As soon as you do that, you lose the ambiguity, you lose the variation, you lose the richness of what it is. So I think with any kind of measurement process, the process matters more than the actual technical approach.
right.
To what Yoshi's comment, in general, and I alluded to this in my presentation a little bit, again, the process matters more. I'm a huge skeptic of any measurement process that's carried out by a proponent of any intervention on their own work, because they are incentivized to show the best answer.
Are you talking about like, the who actually, those who implemented or likely to use the index is the one who's actually designed the index? I mean, that's a kind of accountability loop is what you're worried about and what you're concerned about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we see it all the time. I mean, in the valuation literature, some authors, including myself, have pointed out that if you are evaluating your own work, then you have to put the precaution, especially if there's a potential to do harm. I mean, this is the whole reason the precautionary approach was invented or put forward, is you put the onus of evidence on showing that you were going to limit the harm. So you take for granted that you're going to cause harm. And so the onus of evidence is showing that you're going to limit it. So you don't start by saying, measure how great your work is going to be, because that's in your interest. You say, we know that there's a risk of harm, so you have to show that you're going to limit it.
Sociologically speaking, so, these actually brings into some kind of like a very clear power dynamics, but somebody actually like pushes their technical expertise as a knowledge to define what's what's successful and what's not successful, although they are the ones who's actually implementing those. This is a loop, right? So we don't really have any third parties to really assess the outcome of, I mean, I wouldn't really say equity, but inequality. Anna is asking combination of conditions under which desired equitable outcomes can be achieved, and then these can be tested and viewed. Could it help? Could what help? You mean
Yeah, I think yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and thanks, Anaola. I think this speaks a little bit to Amada's question, right? I mean, I think if you're not trying to sort of measure equity, right? And Yoshi, I agree with you. I think most of the time you're actually measuring equality if you're measuring anything, right? But anyway, but if you're trying to measure equity, you could use something like fuzzy logic to get a sense of, what I've called before, it's sort of these enabling conditions for equity, right? So do you have the conditions in place that might help you move to a kind of a more equitable thing? I think that can certainly be done. And that would likely be more comparable across places. I think the important thing to remember, though, is, and this is the reason why you can't measure equity, it's so incredible, to kind of contextual and intersectional, that it's hard to say, right? So you might have one place where you have all the conditions in place to include everybody except women, right? So does that mean that you get like a high condition score? You'd have to be really, really mindful of that. And so again, I think that's where it kind of breaks down, where you're trying to compare across places, right? Because if you're just doing it for one place, you might certainly use fuzzy logic to get a sense of what the conditions are to enable different aspects of equity, or to and across different groups of people, right? But as soon as you compare across places, then those groups might be different, right? And so that's when that comparison just doesn't make a lot of sense.
I mean, in some ways, the procedural approach, Anna, if I'm talking to you, and you can open up and then talk to us, but when we consider the procedural approach, so what are the considers, conditions, what is enablers, this becomes a little bit difficult to bring it into equitable conversation, or the conversation about equity, because the equity itself is really to provide a resource for some particular groups which has been historically marginalized. And to some extent, this is sort of like unfair, for some other point of view. And when this happens, then procedural approach is really trying to treat everybody equal. And that's not really equitable. So those are the conundrum that we have, that if we actually just focusing on the procedure. But if we know the mechanism, what creates inequitable conditions, and therefore unequal outcomes, if the conditions and the mechanism is very clear, and we often know, those are racism, those are colonization, and then those are the misogyny and patriarchy. Very clear social justice issues, create unequal outcomes. If we know the condition very well, then we can actually see how the policy performs to address those concerns. I think in that way, it could be very useful. But if we actually just looking at the procedure, I think we could really easily fail to address the equity, but instead give a voice to people who has been in the power all the time. So that's really what I think. I don't know, Gerald, Andres, what do you guys think?
Yeah, it's to me it's interesting because it shows. I mean, first, I think Anna, yeah, you could. A lot of it reminds me that a lot of sustainability literature is catching up to both the development research and public health, but behind by several decades. So I'd say in one, what Anna's describing, as I read it, is what the monitoring and evaluation and learning literature has been advocating for a while. This is essentially, they call it ex post evaluation. It's been used a lot in development research. You have a range of conditions, you have a range of different inputs and interventions, and you have some outputs and you evaluate, what's been achieved or not, and you essentially design these statistical approaches or kind of quasi-experimental approaches to evaluate what combination of conditions or what conditions are more important to achieve success. That's definitely, if you do that correctly, if you have kind of an evaluation looped learning approach, you can definitely get at that. The thing you want to watch out for in something development studies there's ethical concerns, right? Especially if you're treating communities as experimental subjects. And so, do you intentionally vary your treatment just so you can see what variation looks like if you change something out? The other side is it gets back to what Andres and Yoshi have talked about with is there such a thing as a standardized benefit across communities, or do you look just within one and you just constantly update? Public health has addressed this in the past by looking at what they call process evaluation. And it takes for granted some knowledge ahead of time of there's some aspects of inputs that we know lead to better decisions. And instead of monitoring the outcome, you just monitor to make sure that you have the right inputs in place. You have the right governance structure. You have the right people making decisions. So yeah, I would love to see more of that in sustainability work.
Yeah, but Gerald, in some ways, you didn't really address those procedural and the distribution, and potentially to some extent the recognition approach, which is pretty much major mainstream environmental justice approach, kind of like misses the point of that framework itself, doesn't really address the current power structure. So whatever the measurement is coming from, is really coming from the government or state, which has been a major cause of this inequity has been created. So that part of it is really the main conversation we need to have, though.
And I'll just say this. I think that's a broader limitation of just doing research in a Western world where we pretend the majority of institutions pretend politics is something outside of the work we do. I think we just have to be very upfront about that. I mean, it's to me been the greatest hindrance on scientific advancement is assuming that science somehow operates outside of politics. I think we have to be very, very aware and careful of embedded power disparities, interests where interests align, where they don't, how evaluation aligns with explicit and current power structures or not. Ignoring that just reinforces it.
Yeah, okay, Joel, I mean, we got one more question.
Yeah, I'll let it to Andres.
Yeah, I have a time too. Lena, you basically asking, do we know any good MPAs? So not Ocean Nexus, but I mean known to the ones who criticize. That's social scientist job, we need to criticize. And then that's really important. But then again, any good MPA? Yeah, there are plenty of MPAs. Whole world which has been worked, which been affected, been implementing all this, they just don't call themselves as an MPA. And the point really is, why do we not need to call them as an MPA? And why do we need to sort of have this word, prevailed? Is it because those are the way to protect some of those people's interests? But if you look at it, by calling MPA, I think there's a clear displacement or disposition is really happening, and then potentially somebody taking advantage of it. So yes, as a function of protection and potentially providing social well-being, there are many places which use the geographical scale as a key to stop some of the activities, but they are not really called MPAs, and we should just really accept that's okay to do in order to just prevent some of the external interest to insert their views towards some places where the community itself is working on it. But that's my view. What do you think, Gerald?
Yeah, Yoshi, I totally agreed. I think to Lina's point, in Mexico, we were also seeing a lot of these we call them fishing refuge zones, where like it sounds like it's similar in Colombia. It's really more of a tool to reassert local sovereignty over what were their traditional kind of like coastal and marine territories, right? And so I find it really interesting because sort of the MPA is sort of like a classic example of kind of exclusionary privatization kind of thinking. And in a weird way, it it seems like it shouldn't be surprising that moving back to a commons for these local communities works so well. And communities like it's like, oh yeah, this is how we've done it for thousands of years until you started
Mm,
privatizing and excluding. Like, of course, people like this model more, right? And so the big question is, does that have quote unquote conservation outcomes of the types that we would want? I'm not so sure. Gerald's paper showed that that's quite mixed, but I think the larger issue is that what people want locally? Right. And that's something that I think is where the key question is, right? So we've been imposing, and I totally agree with you, Gerald, not scientists, but sort of a whole political system has been imposing a particular goal on many communities that historically this was maybe part of their goals, but not all of it. And so I think going back to this kind of much more, I don't want to say equitable, but yeah, maybe equitable kind of way of thinking. I'm kind of moving away from those single goals and more towards kind of a community self-determination, whatever that looks like, uh, is incredibly popular, right? And has worked better.
Yeah, I mean, I put this paper about 30 by 30 and then pointing, this notion of protectionist, neo-protectionist, and how it is perpetuated in the field. I hope the audience will have a chance to look at it because it makes very, very interesting argument. How we divided how we created this notion of love of nature against human being supremacy. So if you love the human being, you're not part of the love of nature. If you love of the nature, you're not part of the human being. I mean, there's just very special, the way of looking at the things. Either you're pro human being or pro society or pro nature, and we just really have to just change this idea. And the only way of doing it is to potentially consider, what is the heritage we have in the terms such as marine protected area. And that's a huge recognition we need to do and be brave enough about like speak up against it. It's I spoke in some meetings that the protected area is inherently it could be the racist, or at least it just really have a hard time to be anti-racist. We need to consider that. And somebody quote me in somewhere. It's a tool. So it really it's not the what tool actually is racist or not racist, but it is the intention that we need to have in order to use this tool, and then that has to be really equity focused. That I believe, in our words, is social justice to recognize what has been used for and what are the implications behind it. Okay, you guys, any final word?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say to that comment. Yeah, no, there are definitely MPAs that are good. I mean, or that coastal communities benefit from. I think a lot of times it's where they have direct say and ownership in it. And as Yoshi said too, partly it's the weird categorization. If you open up marine protection to include like temporary closures, that's been a tool across cultures for millennia for resource management. Yeah, no, there are benefits. I didn't mean to say that they're all bad, but the research tends to overhype, I think, and that's part of the message that
So
I
there's
wanted
one
to show.
question from Cabena asking if it's included or not. It's about a paper, so if you can answer it, that'd be great. Thank you for the question. Andres, any final words?
Just thank you for this great discussion. I mean, I think for me, the important thing is data can be very powerful. I like it despite all the uncertainties and its creations and the assumptions. But when we're working with something as important as the topic of equity is for a lot of communities that are like literally the marginalized, vulnerable communities of the world, we have to be really, really careful in how we're using that data and just really clear with ourselves and exactly what we're trying to answer and why. and who our answers are serving, right? And so I think that's something that I would really kind of extend to a lot of people that are eager to do this work. And I think we're all eager to do it. I think it's coming from a place of wanting to help people. We just have to be very mindful of how we're doing it.
Thank you very much, both of you. We continue to work on data. We continue to work to show the worldview from different ways, but most importantly, we're really trying to, examine any of the narrative out there, which may not be, 100% based on evidence, and we need to have that, because when we talk about social, well-being or equity, that really matters for the people on the ground. And we as a researcher have to be very responsible on this, I believe. I think you all do. Okay, thank you so much. Next month, we're gonna have, we'll have community leader from Costa Rica, Vivian Sol, and we're gonna talk about small-scale fisheries. And please come back again, and if you know somebody who's interested in this kind of conversation, please ask them to come. And thank you so much. Thanks, Karin. Thanks, Andres. Thank you, Gerald. And thank you, everyone who's on this call. Thanks.